Eunice Paiva begins a lonely battle to learn the truth behind the disappearance of her husband, former PTB deputy Rubens Paiva, while trying to keep her family together. The film is directed by Walter Salles and stars Fernanda Torres, Selton Mello, and many more. So, Jeffrey, what do you think about I'm Still Here?
So I'm glad we finally saw this. I am familiar with a couple of Walter Salles films. I know he directed The Motorcycle Diaries, which is pretty good, and he also directed City of God, which I like a lot. One of his most famous films is Central Station, which I actually have not seen, but that's on my list to see. I'll admit that I'm not incredibly well versed in his filmography, but I will say that I'm Still Here is kind of a whopper. It's a film that I was on its wavelength the entire time, but I barely noticed that it was moving for most of it. It begins as this very empathetic and realistic family drama, and there's lots of love between this family. So Ruben and his son Marcelo, they stay up late playing foosball, and they have dinner parties with wine and souffle, and they seem like prominent parts of this social culture within Brazil. When Ruben is effectively kidnapped by the military dictatorship, this film turns into more of a thriller, and it kicks into high gear, and it's very tightly wound. I think this film is pretty excellent on almost every level here. It's extremely emotionally grueling. It intelligently deconstructs the numerous ways that a dictatorship and a military state can really affect common citizens. There are all these great details about how it can disrupt their lives in all these ways. Towards the end, there's a really interesting meditation on how these memories move from generation to generation. It's just a remarkable film. I found it very, very powerful, especially in the closing stretch.
I completely agree. I love how you talked about this being a family drama that turns into a thriller, and I want to expand on that as it relates to Fernanda Torres' character in particular, because for all the hype that we heard going into this movie about her performance, I would say she's not that visible in the first roughly 30 minutes of the film. Yeah. She's more part of this family collective where characters such as the kids, I think, hold a little bit more prominence in the film. This film really uses this part of the runtime to show us what life is like during this time. You were talking about the military, the way the military is running everything in Brazil at the time. There's this seeming normality to the way their life exists. They're hanging out on the beach with a bunch of friends and family friends, all the while these military trucks are coming along in the background on the streets. There's car stops where people, including one of the daughters, ends up being searched and questioned without warrant. As you mentioned, in these joyous aspects of home life, you were talking about playing foosball. There's the conversation, the connections between the family members around the dinner table. I love that you mentioned the souffle because that comes up multiple times throughout the film in very endearing ways. But as you said, when Rubens is unjustly kind of arrested and brought in for this questioning, as they would call it, and subsequently Eunice is then brought in as well as one of the daughters, the film really takes this deep jump into something much different. And this is where Fernanda Torres really starts to shine, and you find the focus becoming her as the film progresses. It's through her eyes that we learn of her and her family's story of determination and spirit through times of this government dictatorship. And so I completely agree with you. I thought this was a very moving watch. I loved this film, and it was very emotionally impactful by the end, so I completely agree.
One film that's definitely in conversation with is See the Sacred Fig from earlier this year. Both the effect of a totalitarian government on a family unit, but this film actually gets to leave the house, which that film doesn't. There's this family that they're friends with, and this family has a bookstore, and they seem to have a publishing house, and so you get this sense that the totalitarian government is crushing intellectualism as well. So they don't have as much freedom with the publishing house and the bookstore. It's kind of implied that the bookstore doesn't have as much going on as it used to. So they move to London so that they could be more free. So we get that. They know some people that work at the newspaper. So the newspaper is always in constant flux with printing the truth versus printing what the government wants to print. So there's all these cool little tidbits we get of how the world is changing under this regime. As you mentioned, one of the daughters, Vira, she's much more hippie, or she likes American music, and she seems to be into radical politics. She hangs out with hippie friends and smokes weed, and she gets stopped by the police and they get frisked. It's this tense exercise, but we really get a wide breadth here of what this totalitarian government is actually doing at large.
I completely agree. And jumping back to Fernanda Torres, I want to talk her because she is really the actress that carries the weight of this film as much as everybody else obviously has a role in it as well. Her performance only grew with me as the film progressed. She exudes such a sense of stability and sureness amidst this tragedy that's befalling her family. There is this like masterful control and restraint over her emotions, and when she chooses to tap into which emotions, which is very particular in her performance. And all this is absolutely necessary to the film's themes about struggle and perseverance because they rely so heavily on her role in the film. She becomes this really commanding force that really drives the film into something much greater as it progresses. So I just think she did a fantastic job in this role.
For all of the praise, there was like a false perception on my end that this would be a very fiery and loud performance, and it's not. It's a remarkably subtle performance, and I don't mean that as a dig at all. I think she's remarkable in the film, but there is so much behind her eyes, and there are so many times that she's restraining tears and you see them just at the brim of her eyes. She has like so much repressed rage and she's keeping it together. She's trying to make all sense of this while also like deciding what parts to bring her children into versus what part she's going to deal with herself. It's a remarkable performance. I mean, there's fiery rage and fear and despondency all within the same performance, all within the same look sometimes.
So I want to talk a little bit of the cinematography in this film, and this also connects to photography in the film because I absolutely loved the use of the Super 8 footage and the photography. For example, early on, we see the kids using the camera to document their life and photos that are being taken, for example, like family photos during a party on a beach. But what is so great about the use of these mediums is how these elements grow in relevance and purpose to the story as time progresses in the film. The power of memory becomes this very apparent theme as they're being reflected on later in life and later in the film. There's a couple of epilogues that take place, which we'll get into deeper conversation about when we go into a spoiler section. But for now, that is a very important part of the direction of this movie.
Yeah, I really like this running motif of taking pictures too. This starts when they take a family picture at the beach, and then later on, after Ruben is forcibly disappeared, they take a picture as a family without Rubens, but they're instructed to not smile.
Yeah.
Because that would look better in the newspaper article if they look like a sad family, but they decide to smile anyway. And that comes up again several times throughout the film. If you notice, whenever a family picture is being taken, there's a very noticeable thing that says, "Now smile," and it's almost plays as this resistance to the sadness of like admitting the sadness and despondency of a military regime and instead like having hope anyway. And I thought that was a really powerful metaphor.
Yeah, because saying that on his face would be like, oh, they're forcing themselves to smile when things are terrible, but it's not used in that way. It's used exactly how you described it, which is a benefit to the film.
Yeah.
So going from here, I think it's time to get into some spoilers because there is a lot to the end of this movie. There's some twists and turns. So if you haven't seen the film yet, I recommend coming back to this review or not. We are going to get into the spoilers. So as we progress into the end of the film ends up taking a bunch of time jumps that happened. It's kind of like two epilogues in a way.
Yeah, it's two epilogues. Yeah.
And now this is a trope that usually I think could go either way for me. I think typically I find them quite unnecessary as they have nothing more to provide the audience than with more information about how things ended up. This is a stupid example, but it's the only one that comes to mind is like the Harry Potter epilogue at the end of I hated that.
Oh my gosh.
In the book and in the film, it was just completely unnecessary. It shows us things we just don't need to see. We could just assume them. So basically the point I'm trying to make is that I like when a movie just leaves you with things that you could think about an assumption rather than laying it all out for you. And this film is a true story. This is all based on real people. So I don't know if it's helped by that, but however, I will say these epilogues here on lie, I think the best parts of the film because it goes so much farther than just telling us a story about how their lives ended up. It fuses itself into this larger perspective, something greater than its own story. It becomes this reflection on our shared experiences as a whole, the intersections between generations and ages and the cyclical nature of life itself. Reflecting on this cycle and the way it was handled in the film brought me to absolute tears. There is this sad and beautiful nature to Eunice aging, people having to care for her after she cared so much for everybody else. This uplifting nature to all that she accomplished in the face of losing her husband to political violence. And this absolute look at the end that is completely stirring. She sees her husband's face on the television, frozen in time, this younger version of him that didn't get to grow old as she had. So, oh man,
Yeah,
as,
it's a lot.
as I repeat
Yeah.
that, yeah, it's a lot. So I think I went kind of full speed into everything that happens in these epilogues, but that was like the emotional weight that carried over me.
Yeah, the epilogue is where the film really clicked for me. And I liked it all the way through, but once it jumps forward in time and you begin to do this like reflection and meditation on what became before is where I think the like real complexity of the themes lies. The first epilogue is basically rooted around Ruben's death certificate and them finally getting Ruben's death death certificate. And she goes on to convey what's essentially the theme of the film when she's talking to reporters. And she says, like, I think a reporter asks her, shouldn't the government's resources be spent on other things instead of the past? And she says, if we don't acknowledge what happened and we don't document what happened in the past, it will just allow the government to do this again at some point. With this documentation and with the story continuing to be told, it's a forcible admission of guilt, and it's a further indication that that history cannot be erased. So it becomes this meditation on memory. And there's an amazing scene where they look at a picture from earlier in the film and they can't remember where it was taken. So Fernanda Torres' character says it looks like it's Vera's birthday, but then later on, after I think her son and the other daughter leave, she writes that it was her going away party because she actually remembers. So she writes it down so that she can't forget it again.
Yeah.
But it's like this personal extension of what she said about history, echoing with her own family. Like, if we don't document these things, how will we ever know that they happened? And there's a theme within political history as much as there's a theme within family history.
Towards the end of the actual, what you would call present day in the film, like the majority of the film that's spending time with what's happening, at the end of that moment, she decides that they're going to move. At that point, she decides she's going to go back to school.
Yep.
And so that decision of going back to school is what gave her what she needed to learn to fight for his justice. The way the film like builds that trail of events that led to this moment is just absolutely beautiful. I don't know. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I know. And we see these minor details of tradition living on in the generation. So now the daughters are making souffle for their mother. That's like a very touching and sad admission of time passing. Equally, like both the trauma of political violence and the loving warmth of family is passed down from generation to generation here. One thing I found very touching at the family party at the end of the film that reminded me so much of the early part of the film, it's almost as if they had transcended the oppressive political regime, because the film is bifurcated in that way that you have this kind of happy family drama at the beginning and then a lot of political upheaval and a thriller, and then at the very end with some sad things that are still happening. It seems like the family has transcended the trauma of that regime and found their way back to happiness and enjoying each other's company again. So I found that to be like very, very touching. And I like that they find a peace within each other. And I think the metaphors work both within a family drama and also a political disruption drama. That's also echoed in, I think, her legacy as she turns her devastating circumstances into a positive by becoming a lawyer that specializes in human rights and indigenous rights, never allowing these things to happen again. So it becomes a very touching story of how to take your personal trauma or your trauma as a nation and making something positive out of it.
So you ready to go to grades?
Yes, I'm going to give this film an A-. I thought it was really terrific throughout it. Like, I was very much on its wavelength. It's like a 2-hour and 20-minute film. I didn't even check my watch. In fact, a woman in front of me checked her phone, and our screening started at 2, and I think she checked her phone at 4:09. And I was like, oh, wow, we only have like 15 minutes left. So that's how engulfed and engaging I found the film to be. As engaging as it was throughout, I really wasn't bowled over and knocked out until these epilogues. And that feels so odd to say, because just like you, I really don't like epilogues most of the time. I think they go their way of over-explaining. But what this film did was use its epilogues as a meditation on memory and how these things affect us through generations. And I thought that was so powerful, not only on an emotional level, but just on an intellectual level. Like, there were so many ideas that I had to parse through and think about and meditate on coming out of this film that it was just a really great piece of work.
I completely agree. I also give the film an A-. I thought it just went absolutely above and beyond what it needed to do, especially in those moments for a film that's telling a true story, making it so much more than just the story and a reflection on these so many things. It brought the film into this upper echelon. I'm just taking that word from you, but
I love echelon. One of my favorite words.
But I know we had talked a lot about Fernanda Torres, but I do want to briefly mention, I'm not going to say everybody by name, but this was really an ensemble of a bunch of actors and actresses that were just phenomenal in this film.
In a variety of ages, too.
Yeah. In a variety of ages. The kids were absolutely fantastic. The younger boy, I thought he was great. The way he loved this dog, and he brought the dog in, and he was just fantastic. But all these like kids added so much to this lifestyle feeling of what life was like, and just seeing how they influenced the film and their older counterparts, like later in the epilogues. I looked up a little bit about the story after the fact, and I saw real pictures of these people. I'm like, wow, they nailed these people down for acting wise.
They show them in the end credits too.
Yeah. Oh, I forgot about that. Yeah. It was just a beautiful film that moment with Fernanda Torres, Eunice, at the end where she's old and she's staring at the TV and she has that realization where she sees Ruben's face on TV. It was such a stirring moment that I will never, I think, be able to get out of my head in terms of film. So beautiful film, beautiful moment. Applause all around. I don't know how to, sometimes I end a statement and I don't know where to go from there. So
good.
All right, and that's it for our review of I'm Still Here. I'm Still Here is now in theater, so if you haven't seen it, go check it out. Let us know, what did you think about this film? As always, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.